Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into something pretty dark, but absolutely crucial to understanding modern governance. We're looking at the blurring lines between public service and absolute, unwavering fandom. This analysis explores a really sobering idea. What happens to political accountability when voters start treating their leaders less like elected representatives and more like literal movie stars? It's a deep dive into loyalty, optics, and political maneuvering, and we're going to deconstruct this argument from start to finish. Let's look at the foundational premise the text sets up right out of the gate. Fanaticism has killed common sense. Just let that sink in for a second. This observation is really the gravitational center of today's analysis. The source isn't just arguing that voters occasionally make flawed choices. It's arguing that the actual mechanism of logic has been completely dismantled by fandom. That is a bold, heavy assertion, and it sets the stage perfectly for examining exactly how this dynamic plays out on the ground, affecting not just the public, but the politicians themselves.
All right, let's get into the first major theme here, the fanaticism epidemic, or what happens when voters actually become fans.
To really grasp this epidemic, the source text zeroes in on what happens when the traditional relationship between a voter and a politician totally breaks down. The author highlights this highly specific colloquial term, multu. Basically, it's defined as the act of supporters providing a totally blind defense, just generating endless excuses for a leader's actions. It's this aggressive, unconditional loyalty that requires some serious mental gymnastics. And the whole point of it is to protect a leader's image at absolutely all costs, even if it means ignoring reality. But here's the catch. This overpowering fanaticism doesn't just infect the voters. It eventually infects the leaders too, completely blinding them to the real world.
Which brings us to our next point, the futility of fandom, missteps, and the governor. The text poses a rhetorical question here that hits incredibly hard. Who else in the world would go to the governor a second time only to be told to return home again? The author uses this specific incident to highlight the total paralysis of operating inside an echo chamber. Think about it. Going to the governor, achieving absolutely nothing, and being sent away once, that's a setback. But repeating that exact same futile action, the text presents that as clear evidence of a leader who is entirely insulated from political reality, shielded by that exact fanaticism we just talked about.
Let's look at how this plays out in real time in the next section, protests versus resorts, a contrast in action. The analysis draws a really stark, almost devastating contrast in how different factions engage politically. On one hand, you have traditional political mechanics. You've got the Congress and DMK alliance out there actively protesting, publicly condemning the governor right in the streets. But on the other hand, you have TVK MLAs sitting comfortably in resorts. The text uses this to paint a picture of a political faction that is physically and ideologically disconnected from the actual battleground of governance. They've essentially replaced the immediate, necessary friction of politics with passive insulation. So, boiling all of this down, the source presents four core, undeniable themes. First, the shield of Matu, blocking any real accountability. Second, this idea of fandom actively overpowering basic logic. Third, those futile political missteps that are born entirely out of isolation. And finally, that incredibly stark visual contrast between active street protests and comfortable resort stays. Put it all together, and the author is outlining a movement that is completely lost in its own script, heavily paralyzed by its lack of accountability. And that leads us to the final and most important section of the analysis, reality over cinema, the ultimate takeaway. Politics is not cinema. That is the heavy, analytical weight of this entire text. When the cameras finally stop rolling, real governance requires actual strategy. It requires friction and debate, not just blind adoration from an audience. As we navigate this era that's so heavily dominated by screens and political spectacle, the analysis leaves us with one deeply uncomfortable question to ponder. Can common sense ever reclaim the narrative? Or are we permanently stuck playing the roles of fans rather than citizens?